I hope you're ready for today's episode. It might surprise you. I'm your host, Dana DePrima. Welcome to One Bite is Everything, the podcast that uncovers what you don't know about your food. And often that means pulling back the curtain on a small farm, on a brand that you might see in your supermarket, diving into the business of farmers markets, dispelling myths, and looking into the business of producing your food. That one bite could literally take us anywhere. In fact, it has taken us into the book-filled and storied offices of some of the best professors of agriculture in the United States. A quick note on how this happened. Jeff Cole, a professor of anthropology at Connecticut College, started sharing this podcast with his students to give them a behind-the-scenes look at farming and food production. He and I got to talking, and he suggested I reach out to Professor Doug Hurt at Purdue University, who teaches and has written extensively on the history of agriculture. I bought his anthology of agricultural history and talked with him about some of the professors that I might feature here on key topics. To date, I have featured episodes that take you inside the Farm Bill, and another that dissects the fantasy versus reality of rural life and how its history has influenced where we are today. I will link both of those in the show notes. Professor Hurt from Purdue also connected me with today's guest, Professor Peter Coclanis of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where I happened to go to school. Embarrassingly, I reached out to Peter without realizing that he and I had met as part of a global board that I sit on at the university. Small world. Anyway, I wanted you to know a little bit about how I am trying to bring you perspectives on your food so that you can think about what you eat in a new way. Historically speaking, I have brought you a lot of small farmers on this podcast. They have a lot to say about the system and about how it could be better. Some of them turn the spotlight on themselves to show that they could do better. And more often than not, we all loosely point fingers at Big Ag as the easy villain. Not today. Today we dive into agribusiness with Professor Peter Coclanis with an open mind. If we are going to think more meaningfully about our food, we need to understand small farms and Big Ag too. We need to think about what we do well and how we can do better. We can not only be grateful for the elite products raised with care and perfect inputs, we must recognize the good and the bad in all of our systems and think more critically about how we care and how, where, and of whom we ask for change. This is not simple. It's just one bite, and it connects to literally everything in your life. Dive into Big Ag with me and Peter here today. You won't be disappointed in the power of this episode to get you to think in new directions.
I would be the last person to say that agribusiness is flawless. It doesn't produce a lot of negative externalities, but certain things that it does do well, I'm quite appreciative of, especially since I do a lot of work in less developed countries, and I see what happens when you have a large sector that is really inefficient, and you see the effects that something like that has on the society as a whole. So my perspective is based on what I see in the United States, but I do a lot of work, particularly in Southeast Asia, and I have for 30 years and work in that agricultural sector as well. So it leads me to appreciate, I think, some of the positive achievements of a modern, efficient, scaled up, highly efficient agricultural sector as a whole, like we have in the U.S. If we go back to, say, the colonial period, go way back 200 or 300 years, we have a far different agricultural sector than we have today, but it is one that has a lot of variation. Even then, there were large farms, especially in the South from the 17th century on. There were large units of production using large labor forces, enslaved labor forces, to produce a limited number of commodities for exports to other parts of the world. There were also small, self-sufficient farms in many parts of the United States, or in colonial America, British America, including the South. The South by no means was all plantations. But there were large estates in the north as well, particularly in the Connecticut Valley and in the Hudson River Valley. There were some large agricultural units as well. The big question in the early period, I guess, is, and this is one that there's a lot of controversy about, is that the farms that were small and self-sufficient, was that out of a kind of particular ideology that they wanted to be self-sufficient, they wanted to raise enough for their family and did not really care too much about maximizing returns? Or was that thrust upon them because there were not good transportation outlets and they couldn't do anything with excess food? And there are a couple of different positions on that. Some people believe that in the early 19th century, there was a kind of change in mentality in American agriculture to make it more market-oriented, more capitalist, more aggressively pursuing material gain. I come at it a little bit on the other side, and I believe that most of the people who came to America to farm were interested in not so much profit maximization, but in improving their material well-being. And if you look very closely at some of the early records, you find that there was very little real self-sufficiency because very few farms could be totally self-sufficient in anything. They had to trade with others. And over time, they started to see the positive dimensions of doing some specialization and trading with other farmers, either locally, regionally, or eventually externally. So what I would say is that the scale and size of agriculture has changed over time in America, but not so much the ideology. One of the great American historians of the 20th century, Richard Hofstadter at Columbia, who died in 1970, wrote a very famous book called The American Political Tradition, in which he tried to disabuse people of the kind of romanticization of American farms. And he has a great line I like to recall now and then. He says, American farmers have never loved land. They have loved the value of land. And that's why you see, really from the get-go in American history, very few efforts by American farmers to practice what we would call careful husbandry.
The careful husbandry Peter is referring to here means the care, cultivation, and breeding of crops and animals. It involves the management of resources to ensure optimal growth and productivity. In agriculture, husbandry includes practices like planting, irrigation, pest control, and harvesting. When applied to animals, husbandry involves providing proper nutrition, shelter, healthcare, and breeding management to ensure the well-being and productivity of livestock or pets. In short, it is caretaking the land and animals as stewards of the land.
Land was very abundant and therefore cheap in America, while labor was scarce and expensive. So what you tried to do was to maximize the use of land because it was cheap. And so they mined land, basically. They tried to get as much out of it as fast as possible and then buy some other land and move. And so American farmers moved quite a bit. And the main thing propelling this was the fresher land could produce higher yields with the same amount of work. So unlike some other parts of the world where you see people on the same piece of land for 500 years or things like that, America was pretty much pushing the borders and boundaries all the time. So what we see, I think, in America is a kind of a propensity toward the qualities that ultimately lead to the kind of agriculture we have today. Historians of technology have argued that if you step back a bit and say, what has America given to world technology? They'd say it's really a couple of things. It's interchangeable parts, assembly line kind of production, high efficiency, medium quality. And agriculture, particularly as it developed in America over time into a kind of agribusiness system of size, scale, specialization, capital intensity, kind of fits in very well with what we have always done in America and other sectors. We have always been interested in producing as much as possible pretty standardized goods. We've never been like the Germans or Japanese and produce the real high quality kind of manufacturing goods that well. What we did was mass produce goods that could be replicated of medium quality at a cheap price. And that's pretty much what agribusiness does. And I think the weight of our history has helped to shape our agricultural system as well. And it's very consistent, I think, with the way America as a whole has developed, in which efficiency has always been prized more than any other really value. And that has its pros and cons. It makes for economically rational production, often being able to produce something very cheaply at a cost, obviously a moral cost and that kind of thing. But I think most Americans traditionally would see, I think, stepping back, the way that agriculture has developed is pretty much part of the fiber of America's entire history. And that's why I think it would be so difficult kind of to change our pattern unless we really took some drastic steps and there was a real sea change. I'm not sure, maybe climate change will do it, but I doubt it, at least in my view. The best chance we have going forward in terms of surviving and even thriving is to double down on science and to try to find ways to produce better goods at less of an environmental cost, adjusting to climate change. But I don't think we can do that by moving backwards, but by trying to use the best knowledge we can to make for a better agricultural system by pursuing scientific innovation rather than trying to go backwards. I mean, we have lots of problems going forward. Obviously, we have to produce more food, and we have to do it in a time of climate change, and we do it with less water and less pesticides and less fertilizer, and try to produce more and better nutrition in our food. But I don't see us doing that by rejecting science. And I think one of the positive things about agribusiness is the close relationship I think it has developed over time with what you might call the agricultural industrial complex, which includes the Department of Agriculture, the agricultural schools of environment, the private sector, developers of agricultural products of one type or another. And these can be used for good or bad, but I think we have no chance going forward if we reject the science, I think.
And what science are you referring to that we might reject, or that maybe we're contemplating rejecting?
Well, I'd say historically, whenever there has been a major shift in production possibilities due to science, whether it was the discovery of genetics and the Mendelian revolution at the late 19th century, whether it was the Haber-Bosch process, which enabled us to use synthetic nitrogen in the form of ammonia to drastically increase yields in the early 20th century up to World War, especially during World War II and afterwards. The Green Revolution, genetic modification or gene editing, these types of things, I think, have the potential and in many cases the reality of transforming the lives of people in a positive way.
The Haber-Bosch process is an industrial method for synthesizing ammonia from nitrogen and hydrogen gases developed by Fritz Haber and Carl Bosch in the early 20th century. This process involves reacting nitrogen from the air and hydrogen typically derived from natural gas under high pressure and high temperature. The Haber-Bosch process is crucial for producing fertilizers used to significantly boost agricultural productivity and is also used in various industrial applications such as the production of explosives, plastics, and pharmaceuticals. However, this process has been criticized because it is highly energy intensive and relies on fossil fuels, contributing to greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. The process also leads to environmental pollution through nitrogen oxides and ammonia release and depends heavily on natural gas, raising sustainability and geopolitical concerns. Additionally, it can result in economic challenges for developing countries, inefficiencies in production, and environmental harm due to over-fertilization and nutrient runoff.
And I think the serial and unqualified dismissal of these technologies, I think, is a recipe for disaster. Without Haber-Bosch, for example, which basically allowed for much more nitrogen to be used in soil all over the world, we would have no chance to really have fed the population in the world in the 20th century. There's a very famous historian of science, probably the most eminent in the world, a guy named Vaclav Smil, who's a Canadian, Czech Canadian, and he's basically argued that this Haber-Bosch process was the most important single innovation of the 20th century of any kind of technology. We had about 2 billion, and we went up to 6 billion by the end of the century, and there's no possible way we could have fed all those people without these innovations. And we've done it using far smaller proportion of the population involved in agriculture. Without scientific agriculture, almost everyone would still be involved in agriculture today because we couldn't produce enough food. And economic development experts, as a proxy for economic development, often the first thing they look at is the proportion of the labor force that's involved in agriculture. If it's high, you're an underdeveloped country. I do a lot of work in Myanmar. You still have over half the population in agriculture. United States, Europe, 1%. And we have more than enough food and fiber and other types of raw materials produced out of farm products, enough for ourselves and to export, while these other places, agricultural sectors, are so inefficient they can't even produce enough for their own population.
Do you see that with some of these practices, these things that are scientific, let's just go with example like the synthetic or, the additives to soil like nitrogen and phosphorus and anything that is going to help increase yields. Do you see this pendulum sort of swinging back and forth a little bit where, yes, we used to be able to use up land and move on, and we're not able to do that as often anymore because of urban centers sort of expanding. And now our soil, we are. And if we're not constantly putting those chemicals into the soil, we can't grow anything. And the alternative is I think nature is also science. So relying on nature and some innovations there in terms of, cover cropping and things like that.
Yeah, I think an argument can be made like you do. I think there's a couple of factors always have to be kept in mind as well, is that in less, shall we say, capital-intensive forms of agriculture, including organic, yields are usually much lower, which means you're going to have to use much more land in order to get the kinds of yields that we have. There are some agricultural experts, Robert Parlberg in particular, has said that if Europe wanted to feed itself organically, they would have to cut down the entire forest cover of the whole continent because they would need that much more land given the yields of organics. So that's one thing to think about. I think that there are ways through science to have less of a negative environmental impact on the soil and on the use of water and things like that. Like some of these innovations in drip irrigation and things like that. Using AI to be more precise in your use of pesticides of one type or another, and fertilizer is also good. You get much less nitrogen and phosphorus runoff into waterways and things like that. And I think everything has to be calibrated and weighed. It would be great if you didn't have to use pesticides and fertilizer, but I mean, this is exaggerating, but you get a kind of agriculture like you have in much of Africa, which doesn't use pesticides and doesn't use fertilizer, and particularly on tropical soil, which is readily leached and isn't that fertile to begin with. Unless you fertilize, you're not going to get high yields. And in a time of climate change, it could be even more deleterious situation. So it's a tough problem, but I think some smart people have to work together to try to find the sweet spot in terms of science and husbanding the resources that are available. I'd say about half of the world's land now is somewhat degraded because of agriculture, either in the first world or the developed countries or in the less developed countries. But the practices in the less developed countries are often even worse at times because of the soil mining that they do, particularly when they do slash and burn type of agriculture and just kind of take everything you can out of it and move on. And that can't go on either. So it's an interesting question. The problem, I think, that has to be weighed and considered is, can we feed 8.2 billion people by going back to a different type of agriculture? We could feed some, and I think that's why in the United States, we really have two agricultural sectors, really. We have this mass agribusiness sector, and then you have a kind of boutique sector that produces higher quality goods using what we would consider more environmentally friendly practices for a limited audience that will pay more for a supposedly higher quality product. And I think both of these have a place in the system, but the Pope used to talk about preferential options. The thing I'm always thinking of is the people that don't have a lot of dough. And we have 40 million people in America who are beneath the poverty line. And I think they want cheap food, or at least affordable food. And the United States, for better or worse, I mean, it isn't as cheap as it sounds, I know, because there are certain negative environmental externalities. But at the point of purchase, we have the cheapest food in the world. It's about 11% of personal disposable income in America. And that is the highest it's been since the 80s because of the spike in foods in the last couple of years. And that includes food bought to prepare or restaurant food or takeout, that kind of thing. Most countries in Europe are 25 to 30%. In the less developed countries, it could be 40, 50, 60%. So when people say to me, the problem in America is cheap food, I kind of say, well, boy, every other country in the world would like that problem. It's a problem in some ways, but for lots of people, it is a life-saving problem. When you think of a family making $50,000 a year, food is, if it's 11%, that's $6,000 or $5,500. If they were in Europe, that would be $20,000 almost. And so think of all the things that a family could do with that extra income, whether it's find a better place to live, pay your electricity bills, get amoxicillin for your kid, buy some clothes, take them on a small vacation, whatever. And all these things have to be weighed into the equation, which makes the food society nexus very complicated, because this modern system that we have created is so interrelated to the rest of society that it is, in my view, very difficult and probably unwise to try to untangle it completely. This really cheap price of food in America has freed so much income for other uses that unless we totally redistributed the income distribution in the United States and made sure that everyone was making a good income, I think there's no way that we could feed the people and have them live even as well as they do. To the even poor people would be worse off, I think. And without a very efficient labor force, we wouldn't have workers available to do anything else. It's the fact that the labor needs declined so much because of agriculture's efficiency meant that we had labor available for manufacturing, for services, for education, whatever else. Many businesses in America, many companies have thrived by providing inputs for American agriculture, whether it is farm machinery or all kinds of pest or plant protection types of products. Another whole sector of the American economy has been involved in processing farm goods, ranging from textiles to bread. It's all over the place. And without agriculture and the efficiency of agriculture, I think lots of other industries in America would be in a far different shape. So while we don't see agriculture that much, and I think that the agribusiness architecture of America really underpins and reinforces everything else we do in America, for better or worse. But I think it's difficult to just say stop right now. I think what I would say is do better and make it less harmful, or don't treat animals as badly as they often are treated in the system. But the system itself has a lot of positives that I think sometimes get understated. I think everyone, I think, should recognize that there's a lot of achievements in this system that we have created, as well as some negatives. And
let's go through that balance sheet a little bit, and then
okay.
let's talk about maybe some ideas for the future, because I've spoken with a lot of farmers of all different kinds, some very, very small farmers, and then some much bigger farmers and ranchers who have changed their approach to their own agriculture in a very significant way, where they really feel like, okay, we're going back to science and to nature and looking at how those processes happen and making adjustments, that we are really seeing these incredible results. But I want to look at that balance sheet so we can share that a little bit. And I've heard you say, obviously, we're incredibly efficient at producing food. The sector development that you're talking about, like agriculture isn't just growing carrots, it's the machinery and, all of the systems and the processing and packaging and transportation. And
it's really, if you look at it that way, and that's what this agribusiness concept really means to someone who studies agriculture. It's all the inputs and the outputs and the disposition of outputs, even after they're distributed, so what happens to the food waste and all that has to get processed as well. So it's a whole chain basically that has to be considered. And when you look at it that way, it's the biggest industry in the United States in terms of value added. And so it's got a big hold. But I would say the biggest achievement is the ability to provide food security to America in the aggregate. Now, I'm not saying everyone is food secure, but that's not the farmer's fault necessarily. That's our society's fault, or the way America is developed. But we have, in principle, far more food and fiber produced in America to meet our needs, and to do so in an extremely efficient way, and to do so with a very small proportion of the population directly involved in production. And I think those are good things.
Can I make a note on this? Because
Yeah.
I find incredibly fascinating, and I think it may go back to what you were saying earlier about Americans, like we've all sort of come up in this American society as producers. We want to be the biggest and the best and all this. And so I often question the whole we've got to feed the world concept, because I think on the balance sheet side, that's not so good, right? We're having some environmental impacts with some of this bigger agribusiness that is, detrimental. That leads to some health issues, even if they're a few steps down the road. It's not like you see it, touch it, eat it, you die. It's just cumulative. And it's my understanding that the depth of the nutritional value of our food has decreased. The carrot 100 years ago might have more nutrition in that carrot.
Without the kind of scientific architecture and edifice that has come around big agriculture, there was a much higher chance that you would have died of salmonella or something like that.
Touche.
By the way, salmonella is named after Daniel Salmon, who was a Department of Agriculture guy who discovered the bacillus in the 1870s. So I think that there are pluses and minuses on that. I think far fewer people are dying of food and waterborne problems in the United States and in other parts of the world than ever before. And in large part, the result not only of big agriculture, but of the science behind food, the development of cold chains and all that kind of stuff too, that is part of the agribusiness way of life. But your broader point is well taken. And I mean, and you know this, by dumping subsidized kinds of food in other parts of the world, we're also often hurting the domestic agricultural sectors in those places because we could either produce it cheaper or because we sell it cheaper, even if it isn't produced cheaper or something like that. So it's not an unalloyed good by any means. And much of it is done not out of altruism, but for foreign policy goals of one type or another, trying to win the hearts and minds of, in the old days when it was the Soviet Union rivalry, and now it might be China or some other part of the world.
One bite is everything. It just doesn't matter which part you bite off. It is related to politics and policy and health and economy. It is very easy in a soundbite to say this is good or this is bad or this is better or this is worse. So inextricably intertwined into our national zeitgeist, as well as practices and things that are almost impossible to disentangle.
Yeah, I think the thing we need is kind of broad empathies and get people talking to each other more and not yelling at each other. You seem to have a relatively open mind on a lot of these questions, but a lot of people don't. I teach this stuff in Chapel Hill, and it's very tough here because of the strength of the kind of local, organic, slow food kind of presence here to be someone who is a proponent kind of, or at least sees some of the value of big agriculture.
UNC-Chapel Hill contributes to agricultural and agribusiness research by studying the impact of diet and agricultural practices on health and investigating environmental effects and sustainable practices. They also explore how agriculture interacts with demographic and environmental factors, and the university collaborates with other institutions like NC State on various agricultural projects.
If I go 30 miles away, though, and go to the ag school at State, they are cheerleaders for big agriculture, and they do a lot of research for them. The state of North Carolina is, despite what you hear about, RTP and the high tech and all this.
RTP is the Research Triangle Park, which sits geographically in the triangle between Raleigh, Durham, and Chapel Hill, and thus NC State, Duke, and UNC-Chapel Hill. It features many high-tech businesses, pharmaceutical companies, and is said to have a higher concentration of PhDs per capita than anywhere else in the United States. In addition to all of those PhDs, there are a lot of pigs.
Yeah, it's the biggest sector of the economy. It's worth $119 billion last year. It's an amazing what they do. And again, it's for better or worse. You go to Eastern North Carolina, it's parts of it are an environmental disaster. It doesn't necessarily have to be. And I think there are ways, even now, with relatively small increments of money, the situations could be much improved.
I think that consumers in general are concerned, but they're also at a loss for what to do. Like, how in this big interwoven system that involves us and the rest of the entire globe, how do we enact change? How do we do better with the pigs in North Carolina, for example, so that we might have better environmental situation on the back end of that we might have healthier food, that we could also still buy bacon at a decent price, and that what we're putting into our bodies is healthy. Smithfield Foods, which operates extensively in North Carolina, is a global leader in pork production, operating over 50 processing plants and hundreds of farms in the United States, and has a significant international presence. Smithfield Foods' extensive operations and large-scale production make it a key player in the global meat industry, with substantial influence over pork supply chains and markets. However, they have been facing controversies involving their environmental impact, animal welfare, labor practices, and political influence. The company has been criticized for its waste management practices, which are said to pollute local waterways and air. It has also come under scrutiny for poor animal treatment and inhumane handling and slaughter methods. Smithfield has also faced allegations of unsafe working conditions and low wages for its employees. The acquisition of the company by the Chinese WH Group has raised concerns about foreign control over a major American food producer and its effects on food security. These issues have sparked public protests, legal battles, and widespread debate.
And basically showing a little bit more about graciousness to the animals you're raising as well. I think all of these have to be part of the equation. And I think you have to get people talking to one another about ways to compromise rather than my way or the highway kind of situation. And that's how it often is these days, because especially in something like concentrated area feeding operations and things like that, the CAFOs, you get people on one side or the other who have a visceral dislike for one another. And it's very hard to get them to say, okay, what can we do to, what do you need to try to affect a better solution? How can we raise pigs in a way that make for a pig's life to be a little bit more decent? What can you do to make sure that the concentrated amounts of urine and feces are not going to end up in every river in North Carolina? What do we do for the people who want to buy Oscar Mayer bacon at a price that is still affordable? What do we do with the farmers who basically are trying to make a living and provide work and are often the leading job creators in a whole community? I think what we need is someone to, maybe it's the government or NGOs or someone, to try to create some space for these people to engage one another in a less confrontational way. And maybe the educational apparatus could do this. Maybe schools can do this at universities or something, but they haven't done a very good job of it up till now.
Most of the conversations that I hear around this are from small to mid-size operations who are like, well, we're doing this and this could be better. I've always felt like the bigger, like the Smithfields of the world, the big processors and those bigger spots, do you think that they're willing to have conversations?
I think with an intermediary who they trust present, or at least helping to affect an introduction. I think if you, for example, work through maybe Cornell's ag school or something like that, being in New York, and tried to, talk to someone up there and say, what you would really like to do is get people talking to one another in a reasonable way and get reasonable people who are willing to listen and not just accuse one way or another. Because I think Cornell does enough work with big ag in New York and with small farmers, I think, so that they might be someone who could be an honest broker. And also between your networks and their networks, they could probably bring some relatively varied group together to try to come up with some possible answers to these things.
What are some of the things that we could change that would have a measurable difference for us?
Well, one thing I would say is to try to somehow increase the purchasing power of the bottom 40% of the population in some ways, whether it's through fiscal policy, some kind of different taxing or redistribution programs, to allow people to make better food choices and to be able to with a clear conscience, pay more for better food. And that might reduce the pressure on some of the big ag people to constantly try to keep food costs or prices as low as they do. That might allow Walmart not to squeeze people as much as they do. It might allow all the way down the line farmers not to try to farm post to post, maybe use a little less in the way of plant protection in order, because yields might be lower but still give you the same net out of it. If we had, for example, in, say, the Netherlands or something like that, they have a very advanced agricultural system, but they have a much more even distribution of income and wealth, and they have a different outcomes from their agribusiness kind of system there. Most critics of American agribusiness would say, hey, they do pretty well over there, despite the fact that they have somewhat the same mentality. But it's because I think the population there is able and willing to support a different price point in the foods that they eat than we are able to do here. I mean, if you're middle class, you have the possibility of eating pretty good in America if you want to, and if you have the time to do the discovery of where the good stuff is. But other people don't. And I think right now, so many of the people are not interested in the quality question. I think that is speaking volumes to big agriculture, I think. Small guys can survive. You get some person raising sheep in upstate New York, and he goes down to Union Square and is selling a pound of lamb for $50 or something. He or she will get buyers. But
I'm curious, though, when you say that, like if we take the bottom 40% in terms of income and we supplement that either across the board or, for example, using something like SNAP. You can use SNAP for a lot of things.
Yeah.
I would argue there are certain things that we subsidize corn and you can buy soda
Right.
with the corn syrup that's in it using your SNAP benefits. To me, that's always been a head scratcher.
Yeah.
I just want to make sure you know what SNAP is. SNAP is the relatively new name for food stamps, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, and it's available to families and individuals who live at or below the poverty level. In 2023, over 40 million Americans received SNAP benefits. But you can also, in a lot of instances, farmers markets, for example, have SNAP benefits.
Yeah, you can use them here. Yeah.
You can use them now. So maybe that's kind of happening on a small scale.
Yeah. While I've just proposed this, I already see, the infinite complexities of it as you did. And just, can you picture the politics in this divided America of today of trying to say, okay, we're going to try to tax differently and redistribute more benefits to this group and this group and this group.
As complicated as this system is, we don't really take that bird's eye view of the system itself and say, all right, well, we're growing this over here and producing this over here, and yet it's having 10 years down the road a societal impact on health through obesity and heart disease and cancer and all of these bigger problems that, we've separated them. It's in these little silos. They kind of have a relationship with one another. So public health is, and agriculture aren't located in the same ivory tower in the universities.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And I think, one could argue that by allowing people to pay more upfront for their food, the overall cost over a 10-year, 20-year, 30-year period might be less because of the reduced health costs down the line. The interesting thing is, you read the Wall Street Journal and you see all the fast food companies are now doubling down on trying to reduce the price of their value meals and adding more chicken nuggets to them and some other kind of stuff because people during this inflationary period, or at least supposed or real, are unwilling or unable to pay any more for their food. And so it looks like it's going to get worse.
Yeah, I'm not a big advocate of fast food, but I feel, to be fair in this conversation, I interviewed Temple Grandin, who has really pioneered the humane or more humane treatment of animals in mass processing. And were it not for McDonald's and Wendy's, they were the ones who stepped up and put pressure on it. They're like, okay, well, the cows that are going through there, they need to be treated in a more humane way. And Temple Grandin designed it. So Like, interesting things can happen on a big scale, but I think if we were having that conversation with more people in the room, figuring out, okay, this is the reality of where we are. What are the steps forward that we could make together? What would we agree to improve? And how could we do it together? What are the 5 things that we could impact by making small changes within a giant system? Because even Temple Grandin was saying cows are on feedlots for too long. They should really only be there for 60 days. And some of them, are there for a year. So she says, that's not right. So I just think there are these opportunities.
It's a good argument, I think. And I think the fact that you are willing to countenance the idea that McDonald's and Wendy's are not necessarily insuperable foes that can never be persuaded to moderate their positions, I think is a good one. And if more people did that on both sides, I think we would make more progress on these issues.
Any other suggestions for the future we can take to, Cornell and NC State?
When you meet people from any of the different positions on these debates and you talk to them individually, they usually are reasonable and rational. It's when they get on social media or they get in groups that people start to act unreasonably and irrationally and more sectarian. And I think the better we could render people into humans on all sides, I think the better we would have it. But I think this conversation, this show, it sounds like you are kind of raising a lot of these issues, and that might help.
This was a really big bite today, in a somewhat new direction for us, unless you listen to the episode with Temple Grandin. I'll link that here for you as well, so that you can hear her thoughts on Big Ag and how it can do better still, and how it stepped up already to make some big improvements. If I could leave you with 2 thoughts today, this is what they would be. Number 1, Big Ag has an important role in our food system, and that role needs to be questioned and cajoled and discussed. They need to be held to account for the system to be better, which we all deserve. And number 2, you are the person to hold them to account. You are the customer around whom all of this business is designed. Talk with your friends and your family. Talk to your grocery stores, as well as to your brands and the companies who sell them. It might seem like a tall order, but that small drop you add to the bucket will help to fill it. I hope today left you with more questions and the desire for more answers. I will continue to bring you bite after bite to uncover what you and I don't know about our food. We are in this together. Thanks for being here. Thank you to Peter for sharing his knowledge and perspectives so generously. And yes, go Heels! If you've enjoyed this episode, learned something, thought about your food in a different way, considered a new perspective, or have had an aha or even a oh, no way moment, please share this podcast with a friend. If I were the begging type, I might ask you to give it a 5-star rating and to write a compelling review on Apple Podcast. That seems to be the place that most readily collects them for new listeners to find. So please consider that. You would really have my gratitude. And speaking of gratitude, there is no way that I could get this podcast out to you weekly without Sonia Dillon, who helps with editing and research, and Russ Chappa, who does all of the sound magic and original music. Bravo, guys. Beyond all of that, my biggest hope is that you will join me here again next week for another bite, another conversation, another thought stretcher. I am your faithful host, Dana DePrima, and this is One Bite is Everything. Until next week, stay curious, keep an open mind, and think about how to use your power for good.